righty. We're going to get started right away. Thank you for your patience. So I'm Caitlin Hawk, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 22nd Robert M. Butler Jack Rosenthal Age Boom Academy. The Academy is designed, as you've heard me say several times now, for us all to co-create. So I hope you will bring your voices in the plenary. The Retirement Research Foundation for Aging has been an excellent and generous partner for several years, and we're grateful for their support, but also for their work, which really intersects with so many of the issues we're going to unpack here. You'll see if you go to their website that they work deeply on housing, financial security, caregiving, and more. So our thanks to them. And I also want to thank my team. From the excellent speakers to the fantastic moderators you'll have access to over the course of the next 2 weeks. A very special thanks to the production side, Jennifer Ware, Nell Conway, Richard Eisenberg. You've done really great work with me. Thank you very much. And specifically to all of our moderators who are sort of the translators here, Paula Span, who you'll hear from just shortly, Juan Pablo Garnham, also this morning, and then later, Chris Farrell, Carrie Hannon, Carol Heimowitz, and Michelle Cottle, all seasoned journalists. So I pass now to Dean Linda Fried and Dean Jelani Cobb to welcome you to this academy. Dean Fried, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caitlin, and good morning, good afternoon, depending upon where you are. It's really a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Butler Columbia Aging Center and the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and with my colleague and partner, Dean Jelani Cobb, who you'll hear from in a moment. I'm Linda Fried, and I have the pleasure of both leading the Butler Columbia Aging Center and the Mailman School of Public Health, and really helping shepherd this 2-decade-long Age Boom Academy dedicated really to meeting the needs and goals of our amazing journalists. And you are a fabulous group. We had a very competitive pool of applicants, and we are inspired by the deep hunger that we see for reporting on housing and newsrooms across the country. It may be that because our society is at a critical juncture in planning for both an aging population while confronting one of the worst housing crises in our lifetimes, that this confluence is so important to get right in terms of reporting and educating the public in all sectors. Now, the premise of our academy is that we co-create it together. So we want to learn from each other and give together provide the really foundational knowledge that can facilitate your bringing forward new coverage of how housing is one of the most crucial social determinants of health and people's lives and future, with the power to impact for better or for worse America's access to not just longer lives, but longer lives with health, what we call healthy longevity. Before I turn this over to my esteemed partner and colleague, Dean Jelani Cobb, I want to say that this is a partnership between the Columbia Journalism School and the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, this Age Boom Academy, and I deeply value this partnership with both Dean Cobb and with Bruce Shapiro at the DART Center. Dean Cobb, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Fried, and I want to echo just how excited we are at the Journalism School to be working with the Mailman School of Public Health, and second, your accolades for the DART Center and the amazing work that they continue to do. So Dean Fried, I appreciate Columbia Aging Center's programmatic vision for an intensive fortnight and exchange of ideas, and I'm delighted to extend my personal welcome to all of my journalist colleagues here today. Of course, I agree with you that there's urgency around getting the stories in this year's theme right. Translating the work of leading aging researchers you'll hear from and connecting it to what you're observing on your beats is the job at hand. And I encourage you to lean in and absorb as much of this rich research as possible, and to ask the difficult questions underlying the state of the American housing crisis. I think as a journalist, this presents a unique opportunity because very often, or too often, when we need crucial information for the work that we're doing on our beats, we get it 5 minutes before we have to file. And this is the opposite situation where you have the chance to be exposed to vital information and ask questions and interact in a way that is helpful immediately and in the long term for the work that you're doing around this. And so thank you and welcome. And with that, I pass it to my journalism school colleague, Paula Spann, for this first discussion about envisioning a just, health-promoting built environment for all.
Thanks, Dean Cobb and Dean Freed. We are going to get right to it. We're looking today at the beginning of our academy at how the built environment affects aging and can power healthy aging. We're looking at housing, but more broadly at all the things that contribute to neighborhoods and communities. How they affect an aging America, an aging globe, and how the disparities in those environments affect us too. And if any of us who have talked to sociologists, geriatricians, and others in the past 15 years have heard the term social determinants of health. And that's what we're focusing on. So we're going to start with John Beard of the Mailman School, who will be talking about age-friendly communities, that movement, and what it tells us about the path ahead. So John, it's yours.
Thanks, Paula. The built environment is really important for all of us, but as we age, it becomes more important because for younger people, it's very easy to navigate built environments that aren't particularly friendly. But as we age, it becomes more challenging. And that environment can impact on us in a number of ways. The first one is it can actually help determine our health state. So if we live in an environment which supports physical activity or where it's easy to get healthy food, that helps us maintain our health state. But if we live in one where that's not the case, then it becomes much more difficult. But for older people, the environment is also important because it can help us to compensate for or adapt to losses of health. So if you have arthritis of the hip and find it hard to get around, if you live in an environment where there are a lot of stairs, where it's hard to access public transport, then it really limits whether you can get to where you want to go. But if you live in a more supportive environment, you can still maintain that sort of activity despite that loss of capacity. And the other way the environment impacts on all of us is it facilitates or puts barriers in place to the relationships which we want to build and maintain. And if you want to think about how the environment exerts all those impacts, one way is to think of it like an onion. If you think about the immediate environment around a person, if you think around their broader neighborhood, and if then you think about the far broader context in which we all live. So let's have a think about the inside of the onion, the immediate environment around an older person, and what's important. One of the things that's critically important is safety, and that can be physical safety. One of the very significant risks for an older person is the risk of falls, and if you live in a hazardous environment where there are a lot of trip risks, for example, cords on the floor or mats, or where there's not something to grab hold of, a rail or something which you can grab hold of if you do fall, then you're at much greater risk of a serious fall, and that can increase your risk of actually having to leave your home and go into an institution. Your local, this close environment is also an important determinant on your ability to remain engaged. And so, for example, in New York, there are many older people who moved into an apartment in midlife. It's a walk up. they've got a rent stabilized apartment, and then as they get older, they find that it's actually harder and harder to get out of that apartment because they don't have the same locomotor capacity they used to have in the past. And engagement from the home can also be these days through IT. Some people have better or worse access to the IT that can help them remain engaged with their family, even if they don't physically leave their home. So all of these things around the proximate environment are important to an older person. But then if you think around their neighborhood, we can also start looking at the social environment as well as the physical built environment, how welcoming the environment is, how many other older people are out on the streets, are they active when they go to a shop, are they acknowledged as an individual, and do they feel like a true member of that neighborhood? Is it easy to access the food that they need to remain healthy, and is it easy to maintain the physical activity, which we also know feeds into that. And then we can think about the far broader policy environment in which we live, and which influences all of these opportunities for engagement. And one of the things that I've been involved in the past is the Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities. In fact, the World Health Organization launched it here in New York. And what's really heartening at that broader policy level is that there's a real interest from municipalities in trying to create the sorts of environments that support older people. So we launched it in 2011, and I think today there's over 1,500 cities, including here in the United States, not just New York, but Chicago, Washington, many major cities, and the same around the world, Paris, London, Seoul, for example. So there's a real interest at that municipal level in trying to build this broader environment which can support older people to age in place and to maintain the dignity, engagement, and purpose that's important to them. And I look forward to chatting with you all and hearing your questions, and happy to respond to anything that relates to all those different levels that influence the health and well-being of older people.
Thanks, John. Dean Freed, I think we'll pick up on some of the themes that you raised and how the environment, housing, and the environment more broadly affect isolation, age segregation, and other things that we know affect mental and physical health. Linda.
Thank you, and hello again. So I'll build on the comments that John just made in several ways. First, I'd like to say that thinking about the housing needs for older adults, both how to design them, how to make them work, how to create equitable opportunity for housing, and how to innovate, are all part of planning for societies for the longer lives we've created. And the other point is that in general, the principle I have found is that as you design for older adults, you actually are creating approaches that are better for everybody, and in fact offer and stimulate innovative thinking that expands the opportunities for human well-being for all ages. And out of necessity, undergirding that thinking with supporting the diverse needs of an older population, because as we all get older, our health status and our resources are very heterogeneous, and assuring access for everyone to housing that is available to them and they can afford, while also having it match well their needs and goals, as John was saying, is really critical. As John said, the built environment actually shapes our opportunities for health and well-being. Being housed is critical. What the type of housing is matters. And I'll give one example, focusing on an issue that we increasingly recognize as an epidemic, which is loneliness. In a lot of ways, the built environment shapes this epidemic of loneliness in many ways. We designed in the 20th century for independence and autonomy. In New York, In general, the apartment buildings that you see don't have public spaces, don't have opportunities to get together with neighbors in terms of the physical space. Few have services to enable people to connect. This kind of drive towards autonomy and independence has actually taken out of the built environment opportunities for connection and cohesion. And how we actually think about designing future housing that includes public spaces, both indoors and outdoors, that supports connection and cohesion, which is critical to well-being and health, has to be an essential part of building housing that supports people's needs. Beyond that, in the US, what you'll find is that a lot of housing has enforced age segregation, right? Housing for seniors, housing for middle-aged and younger people. The US is now the most age-segregated country in the history of the world. We didn't used to be like that. And when we don't know each other across generations, it enforces stereotypes of who that other group is, which is actually deleterious to our social well-being and our community well-being. On top of that, you'll find that senior housing is often zoned in many communities to the margins, to the outskirts of the community, making it even harder for older people to remain engaged and contributing members of their communities and society that they want to be. So how we design housing for the future will enable older people to be part of the community in the ways that they want to be, and foster health and well-being through connection and cohesion. But in addition, and I'll end by saying that as many people who are designing really at the cutting edge of innovation in terms of housing are thinking about the really exciting assets that older people bring to communities, which include a lifetime of experience, include a high degree of generosity and desire to meet their pro-social goals, to leave their communities and the people in them better. We're seeing new models for housing, which range from intergenerational housing to multi-generational housing, to intragenerational housing of friends and neighbors in shared spaces, to even new kinds of housing for purpose, like Brenda Krause Ehrhardt's very innovative models of communities designed, for example, of multiple generations, parents with foster grandkids and older adults, all committed to assuring that those foster kids thrive. So very exciting new models that are emerging that can really build community while they're building individual well-being because of the intentionality of the housing design and how we locate people together. Thank you so much.
Thanks. At Habitat for Humanity, Takia Jordan has seen firsthand how inequities in the environment can affect older people and their health. We've asked her to talk about that some, and also to mention rural communities where a lot of older people live and they get left out of this conversation. So Takia, we're all ears.
Well, thank you. I wanted to start a little bit personal, more personal, and tell you a little about my mom, who lives in the Northwest Bronx in a co-op building that she will likely never leave. She loves it. She has access to pretty much everything that she needs and has a community around her that she's known for almost 30 years now. And I'm bringing her up because in preparation for today, I thought about her and the difference in her parents' lives, who she cared for until they passed on, and where she grew up. She grew up in a neighborhood in Southwest Detroit. Her home faced the wall of the highway that cut through her neighborhood, which was surrounded by oil refineries and salt mines. And to this day, I tell my mom, I'm surprised you don't have lung cancer because She grew up in a community and her parents aged in a community that had none of the resources they needed. And they were only able to sustain because of the support of family. And so just in our experience, we've seen both types of communities. And much of the work that my team does at Habitat, alongside, affiliated organizations across the United States, happens in the homes of older adults. Many of those are older adults living in places that don't have the dense urban fabric of a place like New York and all the related benefits of that density. A lot of that work happens in rural environments as well as in formerly industrial cities like the city of Detroit, where there are actually higher percentages of older adults than you see in larger cities. In addition to that higher percentage of older adults in those places, they tend to be lower income older adults in poor health, and that those communities are already significantly under-resourced. So as we've done this work, I have seen some of the most deplorable housing conditions in these older single-family homes in non-urban, under-resourced neighborhoods, where you also see vacancy, lack of essential infrastructure, and many other challenging conditions for all residents, but especially for older adults. When we do go into homes and do major repair work, we see measurable improvements to the health of the older adult resident. But also we hear from them self-reported improvements in their sense of well-being, safety, and a significant decrease in depression, which I'm always interested in learning more about. In many cases, those impacts are relevant not just to the older adult, but also the other family members living in the home as well. What's critical in many of these places is something Dean Freed has touched on. And during COVID, what we found was the most critical support we could use, to help older adults in these places is that we knew that they were there because of our work. And so I would underscore the point that Dean Freed made, that as we consider contributions of the built environment to longevity and quality of life, that we think about, alongside transportation and larger infrastructure investments or repairs to homes, that the investments we make in networks of support and opportunities for connection are really extensions of that built environment. And for me, this has been most pronounced in the work we've done with older adults alongside healthcare providers or local social service agencies, where we're able to make improvements to a home to support safety, decrease falls and other things of that nature, but we're able to support them more holistically so that after we leave the home, they're continuing to make health improvements.
Great.
One aspect of the positive impact that the work we do have that we weren't originally considering was the impact of, work to a home and support of the resident, the impact on its market value and on the surrounding community. What we've begun to understand is that for most older adults in the communities I'm describing, their most valuable resource is their home. They're not wealthy. But if there's any contributor to their financial well-being, it's going to be the quality and viability of their home. And for many older adults, in addition to having a resource they feel more confident in, they also feel empowered by what they see as an opportunity to potentially pass something of value on to their next generation. One final point, when I talked a little bit about my mom and where she grew up, one of the things we sometimes pass over when we're talking about the built environment is that for many of us, the built environment actively and negatively impacts our health and potential for longevity and quality of life as we age. Environmental burdens, citing of noxious uses in lower income communities, in addition to the fact that those communities are typically under-resourced, resource actually has a more deleterious impact on our aging populations. Many times they're in communities where younger generations are not returning. And so facing some of those larger environmental challenges in our built environment, which tend to be more political challenges, would really go a long way to creating more health supporting built environments, not just for the older adult populations in those places, but for the entire community.
Thanks, Takia. We know Jelani has to run, so I'm going to ask him to talk to our fellows journalist to journalist about where this takes us.
So I want to say thank you to everyone for their input. I also add as a footnote that I happen to know Takia's mother, who, because we grew up in the same, Takia and I grew up in the same neighborhood in Queens, and her mother was a fixture in the community and had many great things for the young people there. So, so I recognize that that example. And so I think that one of the key things I take from this is the interconnected nature of all the things that we are talking about. And this is even in the journalism school, something that, we reiterate, consistently, that all of the themes from, what's happening in the built environment to what's in the community to what's not in the community to whether there are chords that present tripping hazards and, all these elements that go into one part of a story, but what appears to be one story that has connections to so many other things. And so I just want for us in the journalists, and I say us, I mean the journalists who are participating, to really think in these ways about the built environment, the connections they have to all sorts of other elements and themes and beats that we may have covered before, thought about before, the ways that they connect to broader social justice themes, and what really needs to be at the forefront of our minds if we want to create an equitable society, and as journalists, if we want to report in ways that help people actually pursue that equitable society. And so I will stop here. And Paula, I know you have the plenary and the Q&A, so I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jelani. As we're letting people back into the plenary session, I want to ask each of the panelists if you could give us very briefly an example of a program, an innovation, something that you've seen or studied in a community, in a city that promotes healthy aging by some kind of change or development in the environment. John, can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. Before I came to New York, I lived in Europe, and I had a mountain hut up in the French Alps. And one of the things I saw, which I think is really neat, and it speaks to something that Linda raised, which is the issue of isolation and loneliness in older people. The French government brought in a practice where the postman, who otherwise would just be delivering letters, were also recruited to visit and say hello to the older people in their neighborhood. So my neighbor was 100 years old, and I used to see the postman just knock on her door just to say hi and to make sure that she was okay. And that does two things. One is it checks in that she is okay, but the other is those casual encounters, that sort of encounter we have with the post person, the baker, the shop assistant. They acknowledge our existence as a person. And that's really important, that validation that we exist and that we're a valuable member of the community. And so here you have a very simple way of providing that and making sure that we stay connected and stay in touch with every older person in the community.
Yeah, that's nice. Takia, can you give us an example of something you found that actually works?
Sure. Right now, our Habitat for Humanity Tacoma King County affiliate is building out a co-housing development that took the homes of older adults in a neighborhood and actually has rebuilt them in a really interesting way so that they now also provide a community and new housing for younger residents and families, with the older adults able to stay in place on their original lots. It's fairly complex, but it is extremely successful, and has not just provided a new affordable housing, but a new community for those older adult residents.
And this is in Tacoma, Washington, or
It's
Tacoma?
in the Seattle, King County area.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
And Dean Freed?
So, building on what both Takia and John have said, I think that part of the built environment of housing is the actual physical structure and how it gets designed. Part of the built environment is actually the services and supports within those structures. And I just wanted to call out one model, but there are many that enable people to age in place in their homes, and that's the naturally occurring retirement communities. So that people, older adults, when there's a critical mass of older adults, for example, in a housing complex or apartment building, as they age and services are needed, they are actually embedded in the whole housing complex in that area, so that people can draw on them and, as needed, have the kinds of services and supports that enable them to remain functional, active, and support day-to-day fairly little needs, which make all the difference in the world.
Right. For those unfamiliar with this concept, the naturally occurring retirement community is known as a NORC. Okay. So can we let folks come, and we will take your questions, Caitlin? You're going to.
Yes, Alexa Mikhail has her hand up, so go ahead, Alexa, open your mic. And
hi, thank you all so much for this great conversation. I wanted to touch back on the loneliness conversation. I've been reporting on it a bit, and the Surgeon General in the U.S. has been really loud about the loneliness epidemic and really calling it a public health crisis. And I think there's been so much reporting on loneliness, the importance of social connection, right? Especially given kind of since the pandemic and even before that, and sort of what that means for older adults. And so I think kind of trying to report on, right, that we can't really talk about aging well without talking about mitigating loneliness. And then John, you sort of mentioned one potential solution, and Linda, I know you kind of brought up loneliness in general, but I think from a journalistic perspective, really trying to be of service to people and think about ways in which we can combat loneliness on a very small local scale, but also on a wider scale in an inclusive way. So I'm just sort of curious, when we think about solutions, sometimes we can't, not everyone, right, has access to the same communities and the same chances of connection. So I was wondering if you could sort of expand on potential, service, where to look for stories that are sort of maybe posing a way forward to combat loneliness on a local and wider scale, if that makes sense.
Dean Freed, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think that there is some movement, and maybe John wants to communicate to come in on this from the age-friendly communities and cities perspective, but I think there's increasing attention to how we actually create public spaces for connection and community, whether within a building or in surrounding areas around a building. Public spaces that have benches and places for people to sit, bathrooms, and really programming as well to bring people together within and across generations. Programming for social purpose, which really I think is so deeply meaningful to people, to be able to work on things together that they think improve lives and communities. So those are, I think there is a lot of attention to that, certainly in New York, in the Age-Friendly City initiative, which I've been part of. There are many improvements that have been made in terms of just simple things like benches around, lighting, safety so that people can actually go out and walk. But also, I think what Takia was talking about is really critical in terms of how we design the actual housing so that people are not isolated and essentially without communication with anybody in their immediate neighborhood.
John, would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, no, I think Linda's covered it well. I mean, I see it that there's an issue about access. If the neighborhood is accessible, if it's easy for the person to get out of their house, if it's easy for the person to get where they need to go, then they're going to remain more engaged. And there's things which don't really strike you until you get older as being important. And Linda's mentioned benches. The ability just to sit down and have a break for a second. But another thing that's really important and is problematic, and for example, here in New York, is toilets. You know, many older people become worried about going out because they don't think they'll have access to a toilet. And there was a really neat initiative as part of Age Friendly New York of age-friendly businesses, where the business will put a sticker in the window saying they're age-friendly. And an older person knew that if they wanted to, they could go into that business and use the toilet without any questions asked. And it's like a win-win, because the business gets somebody coming in the door that otherwise wouldn't have, and they might come in with a friend who's left in the shop looking around while the person uses the toilet. But on the other hand, the older person has access to something which otherwise might have been a barrier for them leaving their apartment. And then the other thing I think is important as we look at isolation and loneliness these days is IT. And ensuring that people are computer literate, ensuring people have access to connectivity so that they can talk to people even though they may not be physically present. And I think a key issue here is, Linda spoke earlier, that as people age, we see increasing heterogeneity, that people's health there's a bigger spread in terms of people's health and also their circumstance. And where people are on that range doesn't occur by chance. The people with the biggest needs are often the people who have experienced the cumulative impact of disadvantage across their lives. And then they're in the situation where they're not in the sort of environment which is conducive to what we're talking about. So we need to be thinking about those people in particular, and I think Takia really highlighted how important that can be, and trying to think how we can target interventions in those settings.
Okay. Yes, we're getting some questions about the co-housing community that Takia mentioned, and I'm sure we can arrange for her to send some information to all the people that are asking about it in the chat. Aisha, are you up next?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, thank you. Good morning. I too am curious about any particular challenges. You said that there were some challenges, Takia, related to developing within the existing neighborhoods, sort of that co-housing model. It's something that I am looking at, particularly from a standpoint of making sure that in order to age in place, seniors, particularly in predominantly Black communities, have access to home and community-based services. Oftentimes the homes in which they are already living are not accessible. And we've talked about here about, you know, our homes sort of aging with us, right? And Dean Freed, I'd also like your input as well, you know, in terms of how we maintain that community. And I hear that you said that, I think if I understood you correctly, Takia, that you were able to build some new housing but within that existing community, so they're maintaining place. I do hope that is what I heard correctly.
Yeah, the development was actually a development where the older adult homeowners agreed to have their existing homes and land used to allow for the construction of new homes around, right? You know, it took some rezoning, but the existing homes and the new homes are now a part of a community together. that include shared spaces, shared living spaces and meal preparation spaces that were built into what is now a small development in an existing community.
Right.
And so it's, you know, fairly outside the box. So more, let's say, of like a pilot test case than something entirely scalable. But I think that the richness of that experiment was both in the idea that older adults and the people that came into the housing, one of the things they highlighted was the intergenerational community that had been created and how important that was to them. So it had, you know, we were looking at the affordable housing output of it initially, but it had many related benefits, both for the older adults that were already in the community as well as everyone else.
Great.
Let's
Anne
go
Marie,
to Anne Marie. Go ahead.
you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Also for Takia, our state is doing a lot of age-friendly things. It's been surprising to me in New Hampshire. We're very rural. The master plans for the state and local community, but now the Aging Commission is looking at co-housing. That's sort of their next effort. You mentioned that it's complicated. Is that beyond the, you know, renovation piece and the physical piece? What else should I, you know, look for, or can you point me to what we'll see as challenges there?
Financing. In short, I mean, the fact that private property was being used to do the development was what was complicated. You know, if this was a retrofit of an existing more, you know, publicly supported housing complex, likely it would not have been as complicated. I think making sure that people understand the type of community they're going to be living in and that there will be shared spaces, and then, you know, kind of community ground rules for how to share those spaces. That process and consideration is really important to have far up front. So I think those were the two things. The financing aspect was really unique to how the project began.
Great. Thank you.
Ashley, you're next.
My question was about rural areas, just because so many you're the most isolated when you're there, right? You live in usually a detached home or a mobile home. You have to drive to get anything. And I was wondering if you know anything about any efforts being made to sort of connect people who are really stuck in their homes to transportation or because I know someone who lives in Western New York, very rural, 82, fell recently for the first time, and as a result really can't do anything. And the only person he sees now is the Meals on Wheels person who delivers his food every day. He can't really drive because his leg pain is too bad to get around. So I just wonder if are there any innovations in rural areas that you're aware of?
Do we have anything to offer here, panelists? Or is this part of the problem?
We will have in a future panel, if no one has a direct answer, I'd ask Ashley to put a pin on it for a second.
I think there is an initiative in the UK and I can't remember what it's called, but it's about network neighborhoods. And it does have a rural component. And the idea is that you bring together different people in the community to provide some sort of support. And I presume it would also include helping people remain engaged in access.
Okay.
I have an indirect answer. Sorry, Paula.
Sorry, what? Go ahead.
I said I have a little bit of an indirect, two things that we're seeing that we probably need to tackle going forward. One is that we need to start thinking about people around the age of 55 as aging and needing to become connected to some network of support, because what our most significant challenge is actually trust. So when we go into the home of an older adult, typically someone over the age of 65, one of the things that they're very concerned about is being, kind of swindled, being tricked, and feeling that they're so disconnected from the everyday reality that they can't trust anyone. And so we're thinking about how can we start a little earlier, building relationships and connections to aging adults so that when need is there, when need is present, we have a kind of toehold in the home. But I don't have a direct example.
Paula, can I add two things quickly? One is obviously we need digital connectivity for people as well as transport connectivity, and broadband access as well as training for everyone. And there's very good evidence that older adults do not just very well on the internet, but it actually brings them the information and context that are very important. It doesn't replace in-person connection, but it's very important. The other thing is that one of the challenges we have is not about what's going on in the home, as Takia said. It's about not just loss of trust, in part as a consequence of the precarity that people are living in and the lack of safety they feel because they're just holding on often, barely, and feeling very at risk, and the social protections we have gotten so thin that exacerbates that. But the other thing is, in many rural communities and many cities, we've let the kind of civic infrastructure wither that brought people together in the kinds of weak ties that build trust and community and social networks and social capital. The opportunity to meet for things that people enjoy, the opportunities for people to come together around activities with meaning and purpose beyond that. And so while that's not just about the built environment and housing, it deeply affects the kinds of challenges that Takia was talking about, I think.
Right.
I'm going to ask everyone to be really quick now. We have 4 hands up. If we could try to get to everyone. So fellows, a succinct question if you could, and responders the same. Nusrat, you're next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation. Takia, you were talking about the deplorable conditions in homes. I think that's something that we're seeing a lot. I'm from Detroit and reporting on the city. I think that's something we've seen a lot is the conditions of the homes. There's been an infusion of some aid, but it really does not do. I mean, it's just a dent in the issue of the aging housing and the population that wants to stay in it, most of all seniors. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what the potential solutions are. I know that funding is a big piece of it, but are there cities that have done a really good job of infusing a lot of aid or just working to help mitigate the problems and to work to address the deplorable conditions of the aging housing stock for the seniors that live in those homes?
I mean, I don't know as much about how cities are. I mean, the dollars that we use for the types of repairs we do are both private and public. And so on the public side, honestly, we're primarily using CDBG dollars, come from HUD, primarily dollars that are targeted toward weatherization of homes. And it's not enough funding to really address the need, which is why we bring private dollars to bear alongside those public dollars. I mean, we as an organization probably do about 20,000 repairs a year, which is like a drop in the bucket. But I'm sure other organizations that do similar work, like Rebuilding Together and Meals on Wheels, have similar funding sources as well. And often we're working with those departments of aging in our local environments. And they're often these like small agencies kind of tucked off to the side that just do like a pretty static report each year and don't get a lot of resources. Sometimes it's a very, very concerning to me knowing the number of older adults as it increases day by day in the United States, that we haven't gotten to a point where this has become a major priority for our either local elected or even our national leaders. It's something I think we should be hearing more about and talking about more loudly.
Thank you. Stacy, you're next.
Sorry. So healthy longevity, this whole conversation often gets rolled up by, especially like, middle and upper classes in the whole wellness movement. And I know builders follow the money. I often write for and about builders, and I'm just curious about the funding mechanisms and bank programs that might be out there that builders can tap into to help create more age-friendly homes and environments.
Do we have, I think you may know more about builders than some of us.
We
So-
will have, tomorrow, Jonathan Rose will be with us. We can
Okay.
get deeper into this, and then in the policy section, Takia might be able to answer that in the chat a little bit if she has any sources. Jonathan Epstein, I'm sorry to frustrate you, Stacy, but we will go deeper.
Okay.
Jonathan?
Yes, I wanted to just find out. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about New York City and some of the large cities. What about smaller and medium-sized cities? What are you seeing happening in there? Are there any cities where you see them doing a particularly good job in trying to address the need to make it age-friendly? What are you seeing?
John, there are smaller communities and cities that are part of this movement, correct?
Yeah, when I was at WHO, we actually had to change the name of the program from the Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities to Age-Friendly Cities and Communities. And in fact, there are some very remote and very small communities in Canada which are doing some sort of neat things to address some of the issues which we're talking about. I mean, the question is how scalable is it, and how much of it is just it's appropriate. There's one person in that place who manages to achieve the sorts of things we're talking about, but it can be done at all levels, and there's a lot of interest at all levels.
Right.
Paula, we have one quick question. I think Ian dropped his hand, but I think Sally Abrams has a question. Sally, can you unmute and ask very quickly? We have 2 minutes.
Actually, just before we do, Caitlin, just in terms of the last question, if you go to agefriendlyworld.org, you can access the global network, and there's an inventory of best practice that's occurring in different settings. Sorry.
Sally?
Yes, I had asked John in the chat about dementia-friendly cities and towns because we haven't discussed that at all. And that's a big part of isolation, loneliness, and I want to know if there are any innovative models. Sorry, I have a splint in my mouth. Models for those with dementia. And that's probably a whole different conversation, but I am interested in that and reporting about that.
Linda Fried, I think this is in your bailiwick.
Actually, I'll make a couple comments, but I think John probably has some insights from some innovative models in Japan, is my guess, which we could think about if I got that right, John. But I think this is an issue we definitely need to tackle. And there are not a lot of models in the US, to my knowledge, of housing and neighborhoods and environments crafted for safety for people with dementia. There are departments like the Department for the Aging or the health department in a local community, which certainly tries to support older adults who are cognitively impaired, isolated, and at home, but the resources are quite thin and the capabilities are all often underdeveloped.
John?
Yeah, very briefly, there is an initiative called Dementia Friendly Cities and Communities, which you can access probably on the web. A lot of the focus, I think, is on getting people to understand what this condition means. A lot of people are scared of people with dementia and trying to explain, to example, to businesses how they might relate to somebody who might be lost or who may, have some obvious symptoms. So part of it is focusing on making the community more aware, but there are also some initiatives in terms of following people and ensuring that they're safe.
Yeah. I think we are at the point where we are supposed to take a break and everyone take a breather before the next panel. So I will thank our three panelists and all of you for this excellent discussion. And we all get to go get a drink of water and use the bathroom.
Yes, we'll hard start again at noon, everyone. You've got 4.5 minutes. Thank you so much to the speakers in the panel.
Thank you.
All righty. Next up is our panel, Older Adults on the Edge. Just want to make sure Juan Pablo is ready to moderate. And right after this panel, Bruce Shapiro will appear to bridge between the two panels, because we're sort of going from an ideal level to what's really happening on the ground. So we want to seed some of your story ideas, and we'll have time for questions during Bruce's portion, possibly a question or two during Juan Pablo's. So Juan Pablo, we're going to spot you and the panelists. And once all the panelists are spotted, that's your cue to begin. And we will be dropping the panelist bios into the chat so you can learn more and we can get right to the panel. All right, Juan Pablo, over to you.
Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation where we will talk about the housing crisis and the reality that we have where older adults are increasingly affected by the housing market pressures. And we're super lucky to have three excellent panelists. You can learn more about their bios as Caitlin said in the chat. But we have Nick Retz, Margaret Kuschel, and Jan Mulcher. We're going to talk about from their research that they've done of three kind of like parts of this, like kind of how people get affected by the housing crisis. We will have, I hope, some time for questions, but we don't have a lot of time. So we're going to start right away. And I want to start asking Jan to present a little bit about her project. There's a really good pre-recorded video on what it's called the Elder Index, and can be a great tool for reporters working on older adults and the housing crisis. So Jan, can you tell us a little bit about the Elder Index, what it is, and also what have you learned by collecting this data?
Super. Well, thanks for having me here. Excuse me. And I am happy to talk about the Elder Index. Some of you might be familiar with it. The Elder Index is a measure of what it costs an older adult to stay in their homes and stay independent. It's a measure of what it takes to cover necessary expenses. We calculate it county by county for the entire U.S. And we produce it by adding up estimates of how much it costs for housing, for food, utilities, transportation, healthcare, and then a little bit extra for miscellaneous expenses. And our work with the Elder Index shows that the true cost of aging varies substantially across communities. But everywhere in the country, it takes far more to get by than the federal poverty line would suggest. In most locations, housing is far and away the bigger part of the Elder Index, so it's certainly relevant to our conversation today. And our work also shows that many older people don't have those resources, and they simply don't have the income to cover what it takes to get by. So we use the Elder Index to illustrate just how close to the edge many older people do live. When we combine the high cost of housing with the cost of all of these other expenses that I mentioned, we find that many older adults are financially at risk. Our data show that nearly half of older singles who live alone have incomes that fall below the Elder Index, and about 20% of couples fall below the Elder Index. And so the rate of financial insecurity is high across the board. It's especially high for women. It's especially high for the oldest women, and it's especially high for people of color. So, housing is a big part of this equation. And so certainly the precarious state that many older people live in could be addressed by getting a handle on the cost of housing. But, we should note that, the less people have to spend on things like food and transportation and healthcare, that kind of thing, the more money there is available to cover housing. You know, I'm sure you all follow the, you know, the trends in costs, and the trends in the elder index that we've seen in recent years are not good. The costs have increased substantially. Housing is a huge part of that, especially rental housing. There's really been no substantial progress made on reducing the rate of financial insecurity that we've seen in our data. And the resources that older people have has nudged up on some dimensions. I'm sure you're aware that of the recent COLA for Social Security of 3.2%. That happened a week or so ago. But you know, the cost of the essentials also go up dramatically. And so we haven't seen any indication that people are getting ahead through those kinds of increases in resources. And I just want to say one more thing about the significance here. And I think that, you know, we need to be aware that there's a linkage between our homes and our social networks and our supports and our larger communities. And all of those together really contribute to our well-being, and certainly older people's well-being as well. I think this is the bigger story about aging in place. You know, a lot of times when we talk about aging in place, we talk about people staying in their physical homes, that exact location. And, you know, a lot of people do want to do that, but what they really, really want to do is to be able to stay in their familiar neighborhoods and their communities, the places they have friends, they have family often, they have faith communities that they care about, they know the store that they like, you know, they have that surrounding. That is what is really, really important to people. And the problem with housing is that in many, many communities, there really aren't affordable and reasonable downsizing options that would let them stay in their community. So for an older person, when they're faced with a situation where their home isn't right for them anymore, they can't really afford it anymore, they can't, the upkeep is too much, those kinds of things, they often really don't have an option of resolving that challenge unless they're willing to leave their community altogether. So I think that's something that we should really keep in mind as well. To improve the housing situation needs to be done community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, because that's where older people live, and that is what contains the things that are important to them. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, we have much more to talk about this for sure, but I wanted to jump into Nick and Nick's research. A lot of people think that now we have data of evictions all over, but actually getting that data is really hard, and it's been extremely difficult for people in our team. But you just conducted and presented this groundbreaking research that actually allow us to know more about how many kids, how many adults, and how many older adults live in households that experience eviction. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found out in this new research?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And apologize that I have a bit of a cold, so if I start coughing, I might just need a second. Yeah, so we had a first study come out from our collaboration between Princeton's Eviction Lab and the US Census Bureau a couple weeks ago. It was published in PNAS, where we were linking folks who show up on eviction court records with census and administrative data. And this study was motivated by the fact that we've never truly known who gets evicted nationwide. So while at the Eviction Lab, we've compiled eviction court records across the country to try to track how many evictions are happening. Until now, we really haven't had a systematic accounting of who these folks are that are being threatened with eviction. And this is because housing courts collect basically no information about defendants, even basic demographic info like race, gender, and age. Local researchers, organizers, and advocates have tried to make some estimates. Other studies have tried imputing things like race based on the names that show up on eviction filings. But we haven't had a systematic picture of really who gets evicted. So before getting into those results based on this linkage, I want to point out, as you alluded to, how difficult this is, and that it's noteworthy that we had to do this at all to understand even basic facts about the evicted population. I think why this is noteworthy is, for example, when it comes to the mortgage market for homeowners, we have things like the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act that requires lenders to report data on characteristics like borrower race to track things like potential racial discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. But we really have nothing like that for the private rental market or eviction court, which is characterized by its extreme lack of regulation and oversight. So with that being said, through this partnership with the Census Bureau, we've linked millions of folks who show up on eviction records to census data. And so what I'm going to be talking about is just formal evictions. So those that happen in housing courts, which is only one form of displacement. And so we found that about 7.6 million individuals are threatened with eviction each year, 40% of whom are children, and that there are massive racial disparities in eviction. So Black Americans, for example, make up less than 20% of all renters. And we found about 56% of all individuals who show up on eviction court records. We also found income doesn't explain the racial disparities. Eviction rates declined as income increases, but eviction rates remain really high for Black renters, even when they're comfortably middle class. In terms of the age distribution of evictions, while eviction is heavily concentrated among adults, roughly ages 20 to 50 living with kids, there's still a significant number of older adults who are filed against every year. So for example, we found about 200,000 renters above age 65 receive an eviction filing every year, and about half of those folks are actually evicted. And in some follow-up papers, we're also tracking different health outcomes for those experiencing eviction events, try to further link these data to mortality records, and are basically finding huge increases in mortality risks following eviction events, especially for older renters, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's kind of a really high-level picture of some of the dynamics that have come out of this work, linking eviction court records to census data. But I'm going to stop there and then happy to get into different details as our conversation goes that way.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, so I think it's a good moment then to talk about, you know, the worst outcome, the one that we should always try to avoid, which is homelessness. Margaret, you conducted this study that it's super deep in California called the California Statewide Study of People Experiencing Homelessness. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned through conducting the study and also the other research that you've done before we get a little bit deeper?
Yeah, of course. So our group at the BHHI did this study at the request of the California Health and Human Services Agency, who asked us to try to inform them about what is really going on in homelessness, because as you know, there's more myth than fact in this field. Between October 2021 and November 2022, we were in the field and we conducted what's called a representative sample of all adults experiencing homelessness across the state. So without getting too technical, we basically used really sophisticated methods. We supposedly chose 8 counties in the big state to represent it, did basically random sampling in the states of everyone who's an adult who experienced homelessness, whether or not they use services, whether or not they're sheltered, unsheltered, et cetera. We did 3,200 surveys, which have now been weighted to be statewide representative. And then actually based on people's answers to the survey questions, we recruited 365 of them for what we call in-depth interviews, where we had an interview guide, turned on the microphone, and really got deep, rich results. And we found a few things, but I would say the top level thing, one is people who are homeless in California are Californians. 90% lost their stable housing in California. 75% were living in the same county that they lost their housing. This is an aging population and not a surprise because it has been reported before, but we can't say it enough. This is really a story of older people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous folks. Black folks, you know, California has only about 6% of Californians identify as Black. 26% of those in our study did. 12% identified as Indigenous, even though we were not on tribal lands, which is sort of a story for another day. The older adult story is huge. The median age of everyone, which included homeless young adults and homeless families, was 47. The median age of single homeless adults, so not counting homeless youth under 25 and not counting parents in homeless families, was 49. 48% of single adults were 50 and older, and 41% of them first became homeless after the age of 50. The other point I will make is this is important because this is aligned almost exactly with a longitudinal study I've been doing in Oakland since 2013, where we initially recruited 350 folks. They had to be 50 and older and homeless when we recruit them, and we've been following them ever since. And every 5 years, we recruit more to make up really for the mortality rate, because about a third of those have died already. We're actually out in the field recruiting. We've learned lots, but one of the things that has been most important is that the results align. It's actually really eerie how much they're similar. I will say a few things. These folks 50 and older, you might say, why are we saying 50 and older and homeless? By the time these folks are 50, they really look like folks in their 70s and 80s in the general population. We have a lot of data on older adults in the general population, and we intentionally used the same questions and the same sort of, particularly in Hope Home, my longitudinal studies, clinical exams that are used in these tracking studies, and people really look like they're in their 70s and 80s. Most of the folks who are 50 and older are below 65. So the, most cluster between 55 and 64. The median age of those over 50 is about 58, but just to give you some sense of it, in the folks 50 and older, 43 had at least one activities of daily living limitation, 23% had 3 or more. But the other challenge I will say is that behavioral health needs are high. So 30% of those 50 and older were using illicit substances, mostly methamphetamines, 3 times a week or more. 14% were having active hallucinations. And there's a little bit of a collision of these crises in that the substance use, the behavioral health treatment, as far as we have it, is terrible with older adults. And the older adult sort of community really doesn't know what to do with people with severe behavioral health needs. Most of folks in California are living outside. Only about 20% of the older adults were primarily sheltered. Most are outside or in their cars. Lots and lots more data. And I'll just say that we are doing deep dives on some of these data, and we'll be producing more reports at about a pace of every month. And we're doing a deep dive on homelessness, which should come out either mid-November or right after Thanksgiving, that will do a sort of a deep dive on aging adults. And maybe I'll stop now and happy for the conversation.
Yeah, before there's so much connection between these 3 kind of subtopics within the same issue of housing crisis and age. Margot, I think it's kind of important to make the point, and I don't know if you can go a little bit onto this, of in spite that California is often, stereotypized, or like we think homelessness and we equal it with California. There's a lot that any reporters in any state or city can learn from your report. And specifically about older adults. I don't know if there's anything that you can say about that, about what we can learn beyond being in California or not from the report that you've done.
Yeah, and I'll also say something maybe to connect it to Nick's remarks. So we really think that, first of all, the story of homelessness it's a story of affordable housing. That's the story, and that's a story all over the country, right? Like, of course, people with behavioral health disabilities are more likely to lose their housing, but it's really a story of this mismatch between housing costs and housing. I would say all throughout the Western US, homelessness is very similar. I would not expect to see anything different in Arizona, in Nevada, in Oregon, in Washington. The Northeast is a little different in that they have a right to shelter in New York and sort of an effective right to shelter in Boston. So some of the dynamics are a little different. And I worry that the media, this is a Californian, the media focus on sort of the Northeast sometimes mistells the story of what it means to be unsheltered. Because people who are unsheltered, when you have a legal right to shelter, are profoundly different than people who are sheltered. Where in the entire West Coast, being unsheltered basically just means you're homeless, right? They're a little more impaired than the folks who are sheltered, but not nearly everyone is sort of behaviorally health impaired. The other point to make is, of everyone who is homeless in California, 19% came directly from an institution, without any even 2-month in housing or anything. And those are mostly our jails, long jail stays or prison stays. But 49% came from what we call the non-leaseholding arrangement. So 32% basically came right out of being a leaseholder, evicted, had no place else to go. They had, or threatened with eviction, which is, I think, is important for NICS data. The median length of time warning that all Californians had before they became homeless was 2 weeks, but I'm sorry, it was 1 week, but it really splits. The non-leaseholders, these were folks who had been evicted or threatened with eviction 2 or 3 years before, were living doubled up with family or friends. 43% weren't paying any rent. Things fell apart quickly, and they had 1 day warning. The 32% were leaseholders, had 2 weeks median warning. And I think Nick and I have had discussions about this. California, very strong eviction protections, I think, compared to most of the country. The only way you can be evicted in less than 30 days is a pay or quit order. You've fallen behind in your rent, and still then you should have had warning. Most people told us that they were threatened with eviction and were terrified of having that eviction in their record and just left, which means that they don't show up on the eviction records because, you know, they were sort of, they left because they were being threatened with eviction, but it never will show up in a record because they just ran. They had no idea that they had legal rights. They were terrified of having this on their record, and they left. And the median, there's lots of stuff in our report that, you know, the median income of all Californians who became homeless in the 6 months before homelessness, $960 a month for their household. Median studio apartment in California, $1,700 a month. The leaseholders' median rent was $1,400 a month. Median amount they were spending on rent was $700. If you make $1,400 a month, you can't spend $700 on your rent. You'll have nothing left over. But if you lose that housing, you cannot get back into the rental market for $700 a month.
So this kind of brings us back to like the root cause of everything. It sounds, which is the affordable crisis, the housing crisis, and the lack of affordability. Jan, I know that I don't know if we talked before about this, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of like the stories behind the numbers that you see in the index, and specifically what it is like to pay for housing when you might be on a fixed income, on your savings. Yeah, what can you tell us either from the research that you've done or from other sources?
Well, I guess, I mean, you know, our focus is on people who are low income. You know, they're not in imminent danger of homelessness or things of that nature, but they're trying to hang on to their homes. And you know, the stories I hear are about people who are making those difficult choices between paying the rent or, you know, maintaining their homes versus get medications that they need, those kinds of choices that we know a lot about. There are a lot of intergenerational issues that run through this. Many older homeowners are really eager to hang on to their homes, partly because of, you know, what I was talking about in terms of aging in place and community, and also because that's all they have to pass on to their kids. So there's really just a tremendous amount of pressure to stay in that home. Even when it's not affordable, and it in many cases doesn't make any sense anymore. There's too many stairs, they can't maintain the outside, all of those kinds of things. But there's just a tremendous amount of force on people to stay in those homes. And so they make all kinds of compromises with respect to the other things that they do and the other things that they spend their money on. And it's not a good health outcome.
Should we talk a little bit about solutions now? I mean, the panorama is pretty dire. And so if anyone wants to ask questions, while you think about those questions, I'm gonna ask one, but please, we don't have a lot more time. So if you wanna start putting questions in the chat or raising the hand, feel free to do so. Let's start with Nick. In particular, do we have any ideas of solutions or preventative measures that can avoid eviction, especially among older adults? And then if Margot and Jan want to talk from their perspectives, that would be great too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the data we're putting together opens up some possibilities for action at the federal level. These data could be the foundation of litigation through Fair Housing Act enforcement, for example, which protects racially minoritized renters and families with children. But I mean, today eviction filings are increasing in every city and state that we track, and around half of them have surpassed pre-pandemic averages. I think during the pandemic, we saw on the policy side, low-income families, communities of color benefited enormously from eviction moratoria, the really unprecedented rental assistance program. But now those policies have expired, and as assistance runs out, these families are now being left even more vulnerable than prior to the pandemic. So I think there's that sort of big level policy side, but in general, you know, as everybody here has alluded to, we simply live under a system that makes it really difficult to retain our housing whenever we experience any problem. So a sudden health issue in your family or a car crash or any other unexpected problem can snowball into an eviction, you know, and some of these further down the line outcomes in a really short amount of time. And, you know, I think there are some important legal aid programs like Right to Counsel. When tenants are provided legal counsel in housing court, we know the odds of them remaining in their homes increases dramatically. Under New York City's Right to Counsel, 84% of represented renters facing an eviction actually ended up remaining housed. But I mean, ultimately, we need to create a country where quality housing is affordable to everyone. And we were experiencing a housing crisis before the pandemic. The most recent data shows that our cities are becoming even more unaffordable. So I think we need to move towards treating housing as a right rather than a commodity. And I saw somebody posted in the chat about landlords gloating about evicting folks. And I think we also need to talk about landlords and talk about folks who own private rental housing, who are investing in private rental housing as a form of profit extraction and maximization. You know, I think in the last 10 years since the recession, we've seen in the corporatization of landlording and eviction filing, we've seen a huge amount of investment in scooping up both single family homes and converting them to rentals, scooping up undervalued rental property in different communities, and leveraging power that landlords have over renters to keep rents high and raise rents. And I think we're seeing that extremely concentrated in certain communities. And, you know, so I think we also need to look at the ownership side of things and what happens when we treat housing as this private commodity in this system of profit maximization rather than as a basic need for safe and stable shelter.
Margot, I don't know if you have any thoughts from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the math just isn't mathing here, right? The shortage of housing for extremely low income households is brutal. Like California, we're 1 million units short of where we need to be. There are only 24 units of housing that are affordable and available for every 100 extremely low income households. And those are the households who are getting evicted. Those are the households who are going on to homelessness. Only 1 in 4 households who qualify for housing choice vouchers receive them. So I think, you know, it's obviously both a supply problem. You know, there was just recent research put out by Pew. Cities that kept their rental increases lower, like, you know, increasing less quickly, had decreased their rates of homelessness. Cities like Sacramento, where rental rates went up, you see homelessness go up. And just a reminder that renter households 50 and older are much more likely to be severely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their household income on rent. And that is the big, you know, being extremely low income, making less than 30% of the area median income, paying more than 50% of your household income on rent, or more than 30%, is what puts you at risk for these disastrous outcomes. We've got to get to people before they're evicted. And then we also have to realize that in terms of homelessness, most people are already non-leaseholders. So if we only focus on eviction prevention, which we need to do because it would prevent the downstream things, we're going to miss the people actually at highest risk of winding up in our streets and shelters.
If I could just make one little comment, which is just to take us back to an earlier point that in addition to addressing the housing crisis, I think thinking about housing costs in the context of the cost of everything else, and to acknowledge that, you know, every state has mechanisms for helping older people deal with crises like not being able to afford food or not being able to afford healthcare, things of that nature. And so I think that making the challenge with that is that people don't use them. They're not aware of them. The resources aren't accessible to them. Knowledge about the resources aren't accessible. So I think that, that's maybe not going to move the needle quite as much as some of the big housing interventions would. But I think it can be really helpful in helping people stay in their homes if they can just get the services and supports that they already have access to.
And it might be easier than building a new housing complex, right?
Oh, easier, but you're really tweaking around the edges for a lot of these things. The housing is the big problem for a lot of people.
There's being big solutions, but also it's important that the smaller details too. Well, I think we're running out of time, right, Caitlin? Thank you so much, Margot, Jan, and Nick, for this conversation. I feel like I could have talked for an hour and a half more on this.
There's a lot more to unpack, and we maybe should have started here, but we've gone from the ideal of a built environment that is actually promoting health to the reality on the ground, which is health is very hard to obtain and maintain in these very trying circumstances. And that bridges to what we discussed last night about themes of equity around the social compact, and what Nick was referring to is whether housing is indeed a right in this country. So with that, I think we're going to spotlight Bruce Shapiro, and thank everyone. Stay with us, everyone. Thank Juan Pablo for his moderation. Bruce is going to help lead the plenary in how you can embed these themes into your reporting and get the questions going for this session. Go ahead, Bruce.
Hey, thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Juan Pablo, and everyone. What a really great panel. And I know you all have a zillion questions, so if you want to start popping them, question for the panel, you want to start popping them into the chat, please do. But I do want to raise an issue and maybe give a charge to all of us as journalists in thinking about this. It struck me in hearing some of this data, Nick's data, the 40% of evictions involve children. Margo's data about the average age of unhoused people in California. All these things. It struck me that when we're talking about aging and equity, one of the problems with the very unequal and age segregated way our society has dealt with housing and with all kinds of other issues is not just that older people are suffering who shouldn't have to suffer, or that certain problems are not being solved. It's that inequity pits generations against one another and pits other kinds of constituencies against one another, right? So, young people versus old people for housing subsidies, services, etc. We are already in a highly polarized society, and there's a real danger, I think, that and a reality that age segregation echoes through our political system by pitting these generational differences against one another and generational needs, never more so, I think, than in housing. So I guess I would just say to all of us as journalists, as you think about the questions you want to ask, the charge to us is to think about what it means in a practical journalism way to embed this idea of equity into our reporting. Not only, on the one hand, yes, we need to be looking at what are the housing needs or the built environment needs that serve older people well, but are we also looking at intergenerational needs, or are we looking at coalitions that make changes happen? How do we do this? How do we keep advancing the idea of equity in our reporting, beat to beat, source to source, story to story, not just as a kind of abstract social right? That's what's in my mind as I've been listening to all of this. Great panel, lots of questions, I'm sure. Please just raise your hands and throw some questions out, and let's see where the conversation goes.
Let's respot the speakers from that panel so that everyone can find them. Anyone with a question, please raise your hand.
Someone want to leap in? I'll, while we're waiting, I will ask one, actually, of all of you, and maybe Juan Pablo, you too. Can any of you think of examples where the circle has been drawn in the housing area around the interests of young people and old people together in a way that has advanced the agenda at all, advanced equity in some way? Have there been any notable examples of that?
Around young and old. I mean, I will say, in homelessness, unfortunately, communities are often pitted against each other. And it's not uncommon if we put something out about older adults to hear from the youth community, like, this is generational warfare. That's the charge, because I think when you have such scarcity, you wind up pitting folks against each other. So maybe in other communities, there's a little more, but not from a policy perspective. I think there is a lot of potential for supporting intergenerational households. We see that happening organically, but ironically, like, people can get, like, in a lot of places, you're not allowed to use rent subsidies to help your family. You can only use it for like a landlord who's unknown to you. And so I'm hearing a little more discussion that we've certainly been supporting and pushing about trying to support organic solutions, because we see, particularly in the Black community, the families are very tied. It's not like their elders aren't tied to the rest of the family. It's that the rest of the family doesn't have the money or space, or they're afraid of being evicted themselves to take them in.
Yeah, no, and that's actually a really interesting example of where embedded policy is advancing inequity by standing in the way of a solution. Jan or Nick, you have any thoughts on this before I see Sandra's hand up and probably some others coming? Any thoughts?
I think one thing I wanted to say that your comments made me think of, as well as what Margot mentioned at the end of our session, is that I think the intergenerational angle of, like, how these cycles of precarity are built both across generations, but also across the life course, are, like, really the right questions to be asking. Like, in our work, I found that if you, and Margot is alluding to this, if you only count folks as evicted who show up on the eviction record, we found by linking them to actually all the folks living in that household that that's about a 60% lower estimate than you'd actually get if you were seeing everybody in that household.
Wow.
So in our data, where we've linked people on the filing who are often just the leaseholders to everybody who we saw right before then in the census living in that household. You miss kids who never show up on eviction filings, and we found that's a huge population. But you also miss all these other adults living in that household who are not leaseholders. And so it's kind of, through that linkage at the point of eviction court, you kind of see this intergenerational life course process of folks at different points in kind of this deep cycle of precarity, where you see kids affected, where are they going to be 10 years later? You see the leaseholder affected, who are, usually 30 or something like that. But then you also see adults living in that household who we found are often the parents of the leaseholder, who may have themselves been previously evicted from their homes and are now living with their children who are renting. And, there's added costs, and, things just spiral,
As you're talking, I'm imagining a great investigative reporting project here. Folks, just be thinking about that. Jan, anything before we go to Sandra? And then I see Lisa too.
Yeah, I'll just say on the intergenerational family side that, among really low income intergenerational families, nobody may have very much money, but often the older person has the most stable amount of not very much, so they at least have typically a Social Security benefit. And it may not be much, but that's more than a younger family member that may be cycling in and out of employment. And of course, all the children attached to that. So there is a stability associated with or offered by having older people in intergenerational homes.
Good. Sandra, and then Lisa. And then Chris.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes. Thank you for all the great thoughts that you've been sharing this morning. It's been really helpful. My question is, when we talk about getting older people into housing, because they are on fixed income, a lot of them sometimes rely on some type of housing assistance to, make sure they can pay rent. I know here where I am in Texas, housing vouchers, a lot of the people using them that I've talked to tend to be on the old or slightly older in age. But I wonder how effective that can be when in Texas, for example, there's a state law that prohibits cities and counties from enacting local ordinances that prohibit landlords from discriminating against people who have housing assistance. So it's kind of like a catch-22 where you do get assistance, but you can still get denied based on your income. And so it feels like whatever we do, there's no solution to that, at least here in Texas. So I want to get y'all's thoughts on that.
I mean, I think in my mind, I'd be interested in the others. It's like a two-part problem. One is we don't have enough vouchers, right? Without the vouchers, you really can't do anything. But the second is in a lot of, Texas is like its own special thing in a lot of the Deep South where they're like actually almost encouraging discrimination. But in states like California where the discrimination is not legal, it's not enforced. And so we did a lot of work in our study on sort of discrimination, and a lot of people just spoke about discrimination as a big barrier, whether they have a voucher or not. And so I think it's like a both and. We need more vouchers, but for those vouchers to work, you need two other things, really. You need something called the housing navigation. Folks can't, certainly from homelessness, can't actually navigate it on their own, but you need much more intensive enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. And I don't even know what to say for Texas, but you know what I mean? That's an even bigger problem. You need to not have those laws.
Thanks, Lisa. Go for it.
Hello, everyone. So I have been really interested in shared housing models, which for folks that aren't familiar, where two people who are homeless or formerly homeless are paired together, and basically together they can make the rent and have an easier time, sometimes even in a market where there's a lot of discrimination. And I've heard some isolated cases of, elders being paired with younger people and that working really well because the younger person and the older person support each other in different ways. But I'm curious whether the panelists think that could really be scaled up quite a bit and what that would take.
Any thoughts on that, folks? Margot, you look like you're leaping in.
Yeah, I don't want to keep dominating. I mean, I think that I think two different things. Yes, it can work. It's hard to scale. There's a fair amount in San Mateo and now in Alameda County and in San Francisco doing the matching. So from the perspective of homelessness and shared housing, people were less enthusiastic with intergenerational, but spoke about the need to be able to choose who they live with, to have some mediation and to have some privacy. Right now, how the homeless system works, that's hard because of the coordinated entry things. But I think there is appetite for that. I think that might work on folks a little bit higher up the income stream, a little better. When you look at like the programs in the Bay Area, they're mostly homeowners who are overhoused, who are having trouble making their mortgage. They got divorced, the kids left, they've got extra bedrooms, and low income folks, a little bit less the folks who have actually experienced homelessness, but it's still a really good model. It's pretty resource intensive to scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jan or Nick, anything to add to?
I would just say that those are the types of models that I'm familiar with as well, not the homelessness end of things, but rather people who have homes and want to stay in their homes and need a little help. And, it happens a fair bit in Boston, all these students that need someplace to live and would like to exchange a lower rent for some support. So I think it is feasible, but I know that, I think in the earlier discussion, the earlier panel, there was some discussion about trust issues and concerns about, fraud and that kind of thing. And I know those are the conversations that come up when we talk about that around Boston is, what kind of oversight is required to make sure that this is a relationship that's going to work and that there's not going to be any, undue vulnerability built into that.
Yeah. Christopher.
Thank you all for being here. There was a comment made that I immediately wrote down. I think it came from Jan. We were talking a lot about what motivates the aging population to stay in their home. We talked about that sense of community, right? Knowing the person at the corner store and having your church there, yada, yada, yada. But you also mentioned that some of these folk don't really have much from a financial standpoint, and that home is the only wealth that they have. And they want to keep it so that when they do pass on, that is at least one thing that they can give to their son, daughter, granddaughter, whatever. And I just think that's a powerful line to put in any story that I do in the future about, hey, they don't want to just move to Boca and be a retirement home. They want to stay here. And one of the reasons is that so they can pass it down to the next generation. So I think it was you, Jan, that said that. So if that is the case, and I were to put that in the story, I guess my direct question is, how do we know that? How do we know that to be the case? Was there some massive survey that was done and a lot of folks across the nation said that? Or like, because if I write that story, if I write that line in the story, like the way my editors work, I got to link that to some real research. You know what I'm talking about? So that's what, like, if that's what I'm motivated by. Can you tell me like where I can point you to say that? Because that's a strong line. Can you help me with that?
Mm-hmm. There are surveys on older people about what their receptivity to moving, what they're looking for when they say they want to stay. Some of those surveys have been done by AARP, so you can actually get a lot of data off of their website around that. But it's also, honestly, it is something, if you go out in the communities that you work with and you talk to them, you will hear this, because it really is something that people, they literally they may not feel safe in their homes. They know that home is not right for them anymore. They're really struggling to keep it together so they can pass it on. And yet, they don't know how to stay. They don't know how to stay in their community without just sort of kicking the can down the road to try to stay in that same home. So I hear you. And but there are some survey data out there that would point to that.
Well, and let me just suggest, Christopher, and everybody else, Lillian, I see your related question there too. As you go about your reporting, don't forget that you have the Butler Center as a resource, right? I mean, Caitlin and her colleagues, Dean Freed and her colleagues, have access to all of the academic work that's been done. And if you're looking for an authoritative study to help back up one of these points, I'm sure, Caitlin, I'm sorry to draft you, but one of the roles of the Butler Center for us as journalists is to help steer us toward the right resources. So just remember that as you work on stories.
Bruce, I'd like you to take Lillian's question head on, though, because it's an important one. And then we should go to Charlene.
Sure. Lillian, I'll just read your question out because it's here in my chat. One of my questions was going to be how to report on inequity without seeming unbiased or opinionated. That was my question last night. And I guess so first of all, let me say that's a question for all of you in the room to be thinking about. What does fairness and the trust equation look like when we're really trying to address inequity head on? I would just say, Lillian, that to me, it's about following the data where it leads. And that's not about being opinionated. It's about being empirical and about asking questions that those who are looking closely at these policies are also asking. It's a writing question. It's something to work on with your coaches. And I think there's a kind of potentially rich, big journalism conversation in that. Charlene, Heidi, Megan, Gregory, I see we're coming up to 10 up, so maybe keep your questions focused. We'll answer them as thoroughly as we can.
Yeah, I'm really interested in more eviction data, but my question is, can you provide insights on how discussions about equity in housing for older adults may involve engaging with mom and pop landlords? Because typically there's this idea that the mom and pop landlords are like the big corporations and also have money, but sometimes they're first-time landlords and they may not be financially secure. So is there any research or examples in which the two parties were able to come together to find solutions to advance equity in housing?
Thoughts, anyone?
Does Eviction Lab have anything on that? There is sort of a subsidy baked into some neighborhood landlords already who are faithful to the community and underpriced for the market.
Yeah.
It's a great story idea.
Yeah, I know Eva Rosen has a lot of good work on this. I think there's also, it makes me think of some policies that have come up here in Pennsylvania. We just passed a bill called the Whole Homes Guarantee Program. And the idea is to connect especially smaller landlords with federal or state subsidies to weatherize homes and access a lot of other subsidies to improve housing in these conditions, especially in the face of rising energy costs, rising risk from climate change. So I feel like that's a program that actually tries to target so-called mom and pop or smaller landlords specifically. And I think we'll see how the implementation of it goes. But I think that's an example that rises to the top of my mind of actually trying to target subsidies to folks that both improves financial security of smaller landlords while also keeping people housed in good conditions.
And I would imagine that places that have kind of really dynamic changing housing markets, there's going to be a lot of variance in how these issues play out too. I mean, I know I'm talking to all of you from New Haven, where I've been living for many years, and we have in the last, I guess 8 years or so, undergone a massive change from most housing being in the hands of local 1 or 2 family or at least small scale local landlords to having huge transnational capital, having bought up, I think, 18,000 units in our small city. So that's a big issue as well. And it's affecting housing availability for old folks, young folks, and everybody in between. It's a profound issue. Heidi, what do you got?
Yeah, I had a question for Margot. I know that once people become homeless, it can be really hard to exit homelessness for a variety of reasons. I'm wondering if you've observed any difference based on age in that. Is it harder or easier to exit homelessness if you're older?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the median length of homelessness in the entire sample was a whopping 22 months. And actually among those 15 older, it was 25 months. That's really astonishing. We have other data from our Hope Home study because this has this like longitudinal lens. So it allows us to look at people going in and out of housing. And one thing that we found among the elders was that between 70 and 80% re-entered housing during the course of the study. It was generally about a year or a year and a half after they entered the study, but they entered the study at any time in their homelessness journey. But disturbingly, half of those re-entered homelessness within a median time of a year. And the only things associated with not re-entering homelessness, with not returning to homelessness, was having a voucher. So the folks who had a voucher, either through like a project-based voucher, through like a permanent supportive housing program, or just they actually got their hands on a housing choice voucher, for the most part remained housed. Otherwise, I think it's another data limitation that we do a lot of our homeless reporting either by these point in time counts, which don't give you, they're really just snapshots, or using these HMIS databases, which, every county, has to enter homelessness entrances and exits in it. But like what they call a homelessness exit is like you went to your sister's house for a week, that gets recorded as an exit. And so don't trust that data. And we need much better data. And what we found, in fact, for the older adults is if they didn't score a voucher, they often returned with family or friends. Those were unstable and they pop back out. And so I think that's another area that has been underreported. But yeah, the older adults seem like whether they're first homeless before or after 50, their length of homelessness is even longer. They really get stuck there, even these 41% who had never been homeless before the age of 50. Once they get homeless, they get stuck there. We also see health deterioration really astronomical hospitalization rates, and just everything sort of spirals downward. As Matt Desmond says, once you lose, I think he says shelter, I like to say housing, everything else falls apart, and then they get stuck. They can't exit, or they can't exit sustainably.
Yeah, well, before we go to Megan, Juan Pablo wanted to add something to these last couple conversations.
Related to what Charlene was asking, I think it's really important from like a narrative point of view to remember that we do need like good landlords, whether they are mom and pop, corporate, in all levels. But the truth is, like, most of the evictions are done by just a few actors. And you can check it in many of the locations that we track. We have lists of top evictors, and we see that sometimes 20%, 30%, even more of all the evictions carried out are just done by 100 buildings, So I think it's important. This is a kind of like a narrative that we hear about, like small landlords, and it's important. We need to keep them getting paid. We need them to stay landlords and being able to provide affordable housing. But at the same time, the scale of the problem in the US is incredibly big, and we have a system that makes it really, really easy to evict.
And again, I'm thinking of some great investigative reporting projects that could be done about the concentration of evictions in a few hands. Megan, and then Gregory, and then we're coming actually to the end of our time, which is perfect. Megan.
I'm in New Mexico, where we have we usually have a high rate of grandparents who are the primary caretakers of their grandchildren. Is that a group that you have, done work with? And if so, can you talk a little bit about what issues are specific to that group that you've seen?
Anyone want to take that? Beyond the scope of this essay?
I mean, I can just say that we found that a lot of folks who get read as single homeless adults actually gave up custody of their kids because they were homeless. And that was true for the older sort of grandparent, like whether it skipped a generation or not, that in California, where there's no right to shelter, lots of folks park their kids with somebody and then go out to the streets. And certainly a lot of the elders in our Hope Home study had at some point been caregivers for their, skipped a generation. Sometimes they lost their housing after those younger adults sort of hit 18, and sometimes not.
Thanks. Gregory.
Hey, first, thanks everyone for this great session. My question is for Jan. You talked a lot about keeping people in their homes, and I wanted just to get your opinion on reverse mortgages and find out what other strategies are available for folks who want to age in place.
Well, I haven't done an exhaustive analysis of that, but I do know that reverse mortgages are not for everybody. They are, I think, for many people, a very last resort to stay in their homes. There are all kinds of problems that are created by going into reverse mortgages without knowing, sufficiently appreciating what you're getting into. Pardon me. And I think the other thing, getting back to the intergenerational thing, I know the thing that we hear a lot in the community is that there's a receptivity on the part of older people for reverse mortgages that they often get hard pushback from their kids on. And so it's sort of trying to present or preserve that one asset that an intergenerational family has can be actually a barrier to participating in reverse mortgages.
That's a good segue into, it's a good tool for some people, potentially, if they don't have children, but a terrible tool for others. And it strips people of the intergenerational passage of wealth. And that adds to this whole question of cumulative disadvantage and the cycle beginning again. So that sort of ties things together. But there will be some financial aspects. Odette Williamson is a good resource on that, as is Justice in Aging. So thanks for bringing that up. Bruce, do you mind if I just segue to one?
Segue was, I wanted to do one little thing to tie this together. And actually, Lillian, it's to go back to your really good question, which I don't think I answered adequately, but is something that applies to me and to you and to all of us here, I think. when I hear about the kinds of inequities we've been discussing today, I get very angry. I have a lot of outrage. It's not the world that I would like my child to be in, and it's not the world I would like to be in. As journalists, there's nothing wrong with that outrage. In fact, it's something we can and should lean into as a motivation for our reporting. It powers us to ask questions. It powers us to seek solutions. It powers us to seek data. At the same time, as professionals, in order to ensure the integrity, the trust, the effectiveness of our reporting, we need to be aware of the ways in which anger or distress or outrage may lead to confirmation bias. We need to be leaning over backwards to making sure we're looking for contrary data, that we're doing the basic fairness job that as journalists we all have to do. But I think that's not the same thing. Being motivated by injustice is not the same thing as being opinionated in a negative way, right? It's taking injustice, using it as an engine, as a line of inquiry, and then really coloring within the lines of fairness and professionalism and the accessibility and factuality of our reporting on this issue as on others. Caitlin, yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank Bruce and Juan Pablo and these three wonderful panelists and the panelists in the prior session. There's so much to unpack here, and these questions of equity are really important. So I hope that they'll seed some of your story ideas. So next up, we'll be back here tomorrow at 11. Come just a couple minutes early if you could. We're going to throw up a type form for every fellow to start typing in some of your story ideas. These are not things we're going to share, but we want to know what you're starting to think about so we can help source it for you. So you look in the chat, it's a 1-question form. If you could just click on it and start musing, it will help you actualize your thoughts and your stories and build for tomorrow's session. So I really appreciate your participation in that type form. And to everyone else, thanks for a really thought-provoking morning. It's extremely rich, it's overwhelmingly painful, but we'll have some solutions tomorrow. So come on back at 11 o'clock Eastern tomorrow. And thanks so much for your attention today.